Some shows end because they run out of ideas. Miami Vice ended because it ran out of decade. By the time production began on Season 5, the show that had defined American television for 4 years was operating on borrowed time. The showrunner had left to build what would become one of the most successful franchises in television history. The composer whose work had made the show sonically distinctive for 5 years was gone. And NBC, the network that had once championed Miami Vice as a flagship, had originally planned to give it just 13 episodes to finish what it had started. A missing showrunner, an absent composer, a network that had half given up. And somehow, Miami Vice still had things left to say. This is the story of a show that knew it was ending and decided to end on its own terms. By the time Season 5 began, the question was no longer whether Miami Vice could recapture its former glory. The focus was how to end it with dignity. The numbers were unambiguous. A show that had sat comfortably in the Nielsen Top 10 ratings just 2 years earlier had slipped to the 45th place by the end of Season 4. The cultural momentum that had made Miami Vice essential viewing was closing. The decade that had created it was entering its final chapter. And NBC, for the first time, was not asking how to fix the show. They were asking how to retire it. The initial plan was a shortened final season of 13 episodes, a quiet, cost-conscious exit for a show that had cost too much and earned too little for too long. What changed the executives' minds was a combination of international syndication value, the show's enduring cultural cachet in Europe, and the simple commercial logic that a proper series finale was worth more than an abrupt cancellation. Miami Vice would get a final run. It would just look nothing like what had come before. Production didn't even begin until November 1988, 2 months later than usual, because of the Writers Guild strike that had paralyzed Hollywood throughout the spring and summer of that year. The strike hadn't just delayed the season. It had hauled out its foundations before a single frame was shot. The losses didn't stop there. Dick Wolf, the man who had reshaped the show's identity across Season 3 and 4, departed Miami Vice to create his own police drama. That show would eventually become Law & Order, one of the longest-running series in television history. For Miami Vice, his exit meant something simpler and more damaging. No clear showrunner going into its final year. Jan Hammer followed. The composer whose synthesizer work had done more than anything else to define the series' iconic identity left before Season 5 began and was replaced by Tim Truman. Truman brought a grittier, rock-oriented sound that suited the season's darker ambitions. But Hammer's departure meant something irreplaceable was gone. His intro theme stayed. Everything else changed. As the show was entering its final stretch, what remained was a television institution running on momentum and muscle memory, trying to find a way out that honored what it once had been. There were also loose ends to tie up. NBC's shortened season math left 5 complete episodes without a home. 3 aired after the series finale in the summer of 1989. 1 was pulled entirely by the network due to its graphic depiction of child abuse, and aired only on reruns on USA Network, debuting in January 1990. The 5th episode, The Edge, was actually never filmed, dropped when Don Johnson's commitment to recording his second album made it impossible to schedule. The script remains in private hands. Season 5 of Miami Vice looked very different, sounded different, felt different. And not in ways that suggest reinvention, in ways that suggest exhaustion. Crockett had traded the pastel suits and Ray-Ban Wayfarers for denim jackets, stonewashed jeans, and the mullet, a look that the actor had championed during the production of Season 1, but rendered impossible due to Miami's climate. This wardrobe shift wasn't a creative statement. It was a surrender. The pastels that had defined the show's visual identity for 4 years had become a liability, too closely associated with the cultural moment that was already being mocked as the decade approached its end. Season 5 dressed itself for the late 1980s, and in doing so stopped looking like Miami Vice. As the colors darkened accordingly, the neon-lit Miami nights of the early seasons, the golden hour aerials, the Biscayne Bay sunsets, the pastel geometry of South Beach gave way to something harder and more enclosed. Black tones dominated. The visual language that had once felt like an invitation now felt like a warning. The action escalated to compensate. Gunplay increased markedly. Characters diving through the air, firing weapons, sliding across tables, dual-wielding firearms in sequences that owed more to the action cinema of the late 1980s than to the measured, mood-driven storytelling that had made the show great. When a series runs out of things to say, it reaches for spectacle. Season 5 reached often. Behind these scenes, the budget was doing its quiet damage. With no showrunner and declining ratings, the production settled into a cost-containment approach that shaped the season more than any creative decision. Character-centric episodes became default. Just Crockett, or just Tubbs, or in some of the season's most surprising moments, just Castillo. The ensemble that had defined the show's texture across 5 years was now being deployed piecemeal, one character at a time, because putting them all in the same room cost money the production no longer had. Music told a similar story. Miami Vice had spent 4 years as a trendsetter, a show that introduced audiences to artists before they were famous, that used licensed tracks as narrative architecture, that understood music and image as a single language. By season 5, the series had become a follower. The synthesizer work that had defined Jan Hammer's contribution was gone and had been replaced by Truman's harder, rockier score, and the licensed tracks shift accordingly, away from the pop and new wave of the earlier seasons towards a heavier sound dominating the late 1980s. Ministry, Iron Maiden, Guns N' Roses. The show that had once played Phil Collins and Brian Ferry was now soundtracking its chases with hard rock and glam metal. It wasn't wrong exactly. It was honest. A show absorbing the sound of the moment it was living in rather than the moment it had defined. But it was also the final confirmation that Miami Vice was no longer leading the culture. The narrative structure shifted too. Other than the resolution of Season 4's amnesia cliffhanger, Season 5 largely abandoned the continuity that had given the show its dramatic architecture. Self-contained episodes became the norm. Each week a new case, resolved by the end of the hour, with little connection to what came before or after. The show that had once smuggled serialized drama into weekly television had reverted, under pressure and exhaustion, to something closer to the procedural format it had originally replaced. The nihilism ran deeper than aesthetics. Season 5 found Miami Vice embracing a hopelessness that had been absent from even its darker earlier episodes. The war on drugs, which had expanded to become a central plank of the Reagan administration's domestic policy, cast a shadow over the season's storytelling. Crockett and Tubbs weren't winning. They weren't even containing the problem. They were two exhausted men pushing against something too large and too entrenched to move, in a city that had stopped caring whether they succeeded. The guest star roster reflected the show's reduced circumstances. Future Sopranos cast member Tony Sirico plays the menacing mob figure Frank Romano. Miguel Ferrer appears as Ramon Pedrosa, son of a drug lord. Rita Moreno played a Florida congresswoman. Karen Black brought intelligence and texture to Helen Jackson, a reporter and daughter of a former nemesis. And Ian McShane, playing General Manuel Bourbon in the finale, delivered the season's most commanding guest performance. Credible actors, but a far cry from the Miles Davis and Leonard Cohen stints in Season 2. The aspiration that had once attracted the most unexpected names in pop culture had silently departed, along with everything else. Season 5 was not a bad season. It was a tired one. There's a difference. In Miami Vice, even at its most depleted, understood that distinction better than most. The final run had one unavoidable obligation before it could do anything else. Sonny Crockett was still Sonny Burnett. The amnesia arc that had closed Season 4 picked up immediately in a hostile takeover. Crockett still believing the cover was real. The resolution came in redemption and blood. Whatever the arc cost the show in credibility across the seasons that contained it, that episode paid its debt in full. With the cliffhanger result, season 5 turned to the business of endings. Caroline, Crockett's ex-wife, absent since the earlier seasons, returned into Heaven to Hold. In this episode, Crockett helps his son process the news of his remarried mother's pregnancy. It's a quiet domestic episode in a season that rarely slowed down enough for quiet domestic moments. And it worked precisely because of that contrast. A reminder that beneath gunplay and denialism, there was still a man trying to be a father. The Castillo-centric episodes were among some of the season's most unexpected pleasures. Heart of the Night brought back Castillo's past in the Golden Triangle, a shadowy, pre-Vice history that Edward James Olmos's character had always implied without fully revealing. The episode gave the actor material worthy of his talent and delivered on 5 seasons of accumulated suggestion. The lost episodes, aired after the finale, or not at all, told their own kind of story. World of Trouble brought back Al Lombard, thought dead, returning to Miami to meet the grandson he never knew, running from hitmen who hadn't gotten the message. Too Much Too Late, the episode NBC refused to broadcast, centered on child abuse and murder, featured a kind of darkness considered too extreme even for a show that had pushed the boundaries of network television for 5 years. It also marked Pam Grier's final appearance in the series as NYPD Detective Valerie Gordon. Then there was Leap of Faith, an episode that carried ambitions the season itself could barely afford. Conceived as a backdoor pilot for a planned Miami Vice spin-off focusing on a younger group of officers. The series was never picked up. The irony runs deep. The show it most resembled in conception was 21 Jump Street, one of the program's most frequently cited as having accelerated Miami Vice's own decline. Continuity was not an option, reinvention was out of the question, and some loose ends Miami Vice understood were better left untied. This final run is not a season that asks to be defended. It simply asks to be understood. With key figures gone, a budget hauled out, and with scripts that had been compromised by a writer's strike before production even began, we find that even here, in the final chapter of a show running on fumes, there were moments where Miami Vice remembered exactly what it was capable of. And the following 5 episodes are the proof. At number 5, we have Hostile Takeover. The season opener had a mission: resolve the cliffhanger and do it convincingly. It actually did more than that. Crockett, still operating as Sonny Burnett, takes control of a drug cartel by playing its factions against each other. There's no Vice Squad to the rescue, no cavalry, just a man deep inside a role he can no longer distinguish from himself. The episode opens with Underworld's Underneath the Radar, a track that shouldn't work in a police drama, but somehow works completely. Its cold, electronic pulse scores every party sequence where Burnett moves through the cartel's world with the ease of someone who belongs there, which is precisely the problem. Don Johnson plays it without a safety net. No wink to the audiences, no hint that Crockett is still in there. The specific achievement is this: Johnson makes Burnett's competence genuinely frightening. He doesn't play a man struggling to maintain a cover. He plays a man who has stopped struggling. The audience is left to work out without any assistance from the performance, whether Sonny Crockett still exists inside that. Following up at number 4, we have Line of Fire. Crockett and Tubbs are assigned to protect a young, cocky witness who would rather party than cooperate with the police. The execution is sharp, the pacing taut, and the episode carries the easy chemistry between Johnson and Thomas that the season's more fragmented structure had been slowly eroding. The musical choices define the episode, and that alone justifies its presence on this list. Iron Maiden's Only the Good Die Young and Derek and the Dominoes' Layla, 2 songs from completely different eras, sit side by side in the same episode and same sequence, and somehow both work. Even in its last run, the show, that was now following culture rather than leading it, could still make music and image function as a single instrument. Next at number 3 is The Cell Within, possibly the darkest episode in the show's entire run. In it, Tubbs is taken prisoner, along with a drug dealer, a young prostitute, an imprisoned psychologist in the personal dungeon of a supposedly reformed killer he once put behind bars. The dungeon comes equipped with an electric chair. There are no musical highlights. There is no iconic track playing over chase sequence. There is just the slow, suffocating pressure of a man trapped in a space designed to break people, trying to keep himself and three strangers alive long enough for rescue to arrive. By now you know the gist. No pastels, no Biscayne Bay, no Ferrari. Just Tubbs, a room, and the accumulated skill of a show that, even at its most depleted, still knew how to construct genuine dread. Philip Michael Thomas carries every frame of this episode. It may very well be his finest hour in the entire series. In the runner-up position, we find Redemption in Blood. This is where the amnesia arc ends. Tubbs has come to believe that Burnett, the man wearing Crockett's face, has gone too far to bring back. The loyalty that has defined the partnership across 5 seasons is under examination for the first time, and the memory, once it returns, doesn't arrive cleanly. It lands in fragments, in pain, in the middle of a situation that has already gone too far to resolve neatly. The duet featuring Peter Gabriel and Kate Bush, Don't Give Up, scores the pivotal scene, a song about holding on when everything is telling you to let go, placed with the precision the show had once deployed routinely and was now dropping for one last time. Even though the storyline was particularly divisive, this episode truly showcases redemption. And finally, topping this list, there could be no other choice, the series finale, Freefall. This 2-hour segment is not a triumphant ending. It was never going to be. Crockett and Tubbs are recruited to protect General Manuel Bourbon, a Latin American dictator with information on major players in the drug underworld. The assignment is complicated, the stakes are real, and the episode delivers the kind of propulsive, location-driven storytelling that the budget cuts of the final seasons had made increasingly rare. For 2 hours, Miami Vice looked and felt like itself again. And then it ended. Crockett seemingly retires from the force. Tubbs returns to New York. They say goodbye without ceremony. Two men who had spent 5 years in each other's company parting the way people actually part, without speeches or declarations. Terry Katz, Tell Me, scores the final montage. It stands as one of the most moving moments in the series run. Again, the show doesn't go out with a bang, it goes out with an exhale, which for a series that had been holding its breath for 2 years feels exactly right. Miami Vice ended like the decade it represented, in 1989. By the time the final episode aired, the show had slipped to the 58th position in the Nielsen ratings, a number that would have been unimaginable to the executives who had watched it dominate the top 10 just 3 years earlier. The cultural moment that had made it essential viewing was effectively over. Some of the aesthetics were already a punchline. The synthesizer soundtrack was already nostalgic, and the show that had defined a decade was ending inside it, unable to outlast the very moment it created. But Miami Vice didn't simply survive the decade. In fact, the decade survived in it. Everything that came after was building on the foundations the show had laid. Bad Boys borrowed the template. Michael Mann's Own Heat refined it. GTA Vice City introduced the show's aesthetics and moral ambiguity to a generation that hadn't been born when the pilot aired. The 2006 film adaptation, with Mann returning to his own creation, proved the framework was somewhat durable, enough to survive translation into a completely different era. The final 3 seasons are full of moments that prove the series was capable of adapting. It never lacked talent or instinct, but merely stability. The one thing that ratings pressure, budget cuts, and a revolving door of showrunners had systematically removed. That uncertainty was the show's condition, not its character. The issue with defining a decade is that you can't exist outside it. Miami Vice was the 1980s, not a reflection of them, not a commentary on them, but an expression of them, in real time. At the height of their excess, their anxiety, and their strange, neon-lit beauty. When the decade ended, the show ended with it. That's not a failure. That's the kind of artistic integrity most television never achieves. The Vice effect didn't end in 1989, it just went underground. And it's still there. In every crime drama that treats music as narrative, in every show that understands that style is not the opposite of substance, in every series that dares to make a scene feel like a character. Miami Vice didn't survive the 1980s, but the 1980s, in some essential way, survived because of it.